Sight for a date.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of your Pennsylvania Dutch Minute. Another viewer request coming at you, and as many of you know, I'm a big fan of history, particularly American history. I had a viewer email me about doing a video about the Pennsylvania Dutch that lived in Virginia. And I knew a little bit about that story, but I never really went too in depth with it because I didn't have a personal connection to it, I guess. But after doing some research, I'm absolutely fascinated with some of the stuff that I found out, and I don't know how many of you actually knew or know that the Pennsylvania Dutch, there was a large contingency of Pennsylvania Dutch that made their way south early on in American history. And I'd like to tell their story a little bit today. This isn't an in-depth history lesson here. I just want to scrape the surface, and if you're interested, then you can go out and find more information on your own. But let's talk a little bit. I just think it's absolutely fascinating. So the Shenandoah Valley is the area of Virginia where they settled, and I think many of you know where that is. It's in the western part of the state, and also into parts of West Virginia, was home or is home to a long-established German-American community dating back to the 1600s. The earliest German settlers to Shenandoah, sometimes known as the Shenandoah Deutsch or the Valley Dutch, were Pennsylvania Dutch migrants who arrived from southeastern Pennsylvania, and these German settlers traveled southward along what became known as the Great Wagon Road. And I think we need to talk just a little bit about the Great Wagon Road as well. The Great Wagon Road was a heavily traveled primary route for early settlement of the southern United States, particularly the back country of the New World. Although a wide variety of settlers traveled southward on the road, two dominant cultures emerged. The German Palatinates, the Pennsylvania Dutch, and Scotch-Irish American immigrants arrived in huge numbers because of undurable conditions in Europe. The Germans, the Pennsylvania Dutch, tended to find rich farmland and work it heavily and become stable and prosperous. The other group, known as the Presbyterian or Ulster Scotch, these are your Scotch-Irish, and maybe some of you are descendants of these people, tended to be restless, clannish, and fiercely independent, and they formed what became known as the Appalachian culture that we think of today. Partly because of the language difference, these two groups tended to keep to themselves. They did not interact there in Virginia. The Great Wagon Road, if we look at the map that I have here, you'll notice that, a lot of the immigrants came in through Philadelphia where they got off the boat, entered the colonies, and then took the Great Wagon Road that passed through Lancaster and York and then turned south, and the road crossed the Potomac River and entered into what is today the Shenandoah Valley near present-day Martinsburg, West Virginia, and continued south in the valley via the Great Warriors Trail, which was established by centuries of Indian travel over ancient trails created by migrating buffalo herds. That's an interesting point. Although traffic on the road increased dramatically after 1744, it was reduced to very few people during the French and Indian War. That was between the years 1756 and 1763. But after the war ended in 1763, it is said that it was the most heavily traveled main road in colonial America. So that's the Great Wagon Road. Let's go back to these Pennsylvania Dutch that were living there in the Shenandoah Valley. From the colonial period all the way up to early 1900s, people of the Germanic heritage formed the social and economic backbone of the Shenandoah Valley. The majority of the German settlers in the valley belonged to Anabaptist denominations such as the Mennonites and the Dunkards, which today is the Brethren Church, and other small groups. There were some German Catholics and German Jews that made the trip down into that part of Shenandoah Valley as well. Due to both economic reasons and Anabaptist objections to slavery, the German settlers of the valley owned very few slaves, and consequently, the area has never had a large African American population. The German language was commonly spoken in Shenandoah up until World War I, when anti-German sentiment resulted in many German Americans abandoning their language and customs in order to assimilate into the cultural mainstream. Of course, we found that to be true in Pennsylvania as well, but since I think there was such a larger number of Pennsylvania Dutch, our language was able to maintain, even though World War I, dealt a major blow to the language. But in Virginia, since they were cut off from the rest of us, I could see why that language then really, really took a hard hit. The German contribution to the culture of the Shenandoah Valley has been substantial, with Germans popularizing Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine and Shapenote singing, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. While most white Southerners have been of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic stock, the German migration to Shenandoah has given the area some ethnic diversity. Quote, a characteristic more Pennsylvanian than Virginian. Quote, while the valley is geographically southern, this German contribution from the mid-Atlantic has made it appear more northern. The Pennsylvania Dutch settlers in the Shenandoah brought with them many staples of the Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine, things like sauerkraut, apple butter, scrapple, pancakes, knödeln, rivels with ham bone, so things like pot pie, of course we know, and the staple grains were wheat, spelt, and barley, just like in Pennsylvania. One thing that really intrigued me, and I did not know this, and I kind of hit myself a little bit about this, coming back to the Shapenote singing. In 1809, a Mennonite pastor by the name of Joseph Funk and other descendants of the German Anabaptists who had been persecuted during the European Wars of Religion settled in what is now the area known as Singer's Glen, Virginia. Funk was a well-known music teacher and composer, and thanks largely to him, Singer's Glen is sometimes considered the birthplace of gospel music in American South. So I think this is crazy for someone that really enjoys folk music. As many of you know, the Amish, the Mennonite, the Anabaptists have this tradition of Shapenote singing, or singing without accompaniment. And that was brought to Virginia, and we have the creation then of what becomes known as Shapenote singing, which is really the foundation for a lot of American hymns, of the Christian hymns, and that would go on to influence early American folk music, American country music. When we look at early groups like the Carter family, which came out of Virginia, taking some of these old Shapenote hymns and then turning them into modern, quote unquote, modern music. I never made the connection to Pennsylvania Dutch. I think that's just insane. I think that's so neat, especially someone that I play folk music, and we do a lot of those old timey songs, and I just never put two and two together that a lot of them might have roots in or DNA coming from Anabaptist hymnary. I just think it's crazy. I digress. Sorry. A little bit more information for you. The last people to retain the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect were the Old Order Mennonite community in what is today Rockingham County, Virginia. While Old Order Mennonites exclusively use English language today, some older Mennonites did still speak German at home, or Pennsylvania Dutch at home, up until the 1940s and 50s. So I guess that's where we can kind of cut off, that's when the language really started to die out totally post-World War II. One other thing I found online, which I think is really interesting, has to do with integration of the Pennsylvania Dutch into the greater Virginia society. So just one last story. Throughout the history of the German-American community life in Shenandoah Valley, the Germans experienced some incidents of discrimination, but the community remained without serious persecution for most of its history. During the 1700s and the early 1800s, the Germans were largely accepted by the Anglo-Saxons and the Scotch-Irish who lived in the valley with them, and were considered to be merely a different shade of the native-born white American population of the area. However, and this is what I really find interesting, the Germans settled the land at the same time as those English and Scots-Irish, so there were no competing claims for land ownership. The main area of ethnic conflict was in Winchester, Virginia, where there was a mixed population of Germans, English, Irish, and Scotch-Irish. Riots broke out between the Germans and the Scotch-Irish in 1759, wherein the Germans were much beaten and hurt. Anti-Irish sentiment existed among the Germans, and it was once customary for Germans to exhibit an effigy of St. Patrick on St. Patrick's Day with a string of potatoes around his neck, and an effigy of his wife, Sheely, with her apron loaded with potatoes. This enraged Irish Catholics, who would retaliate against this indignity by displaying an effigy of St. Michael on St. Michael's Day with a rope of sauerkraut around his neck. During these spats between the Germans and the Irish, quote, many a black eye, bloody nose, and broken head was a result. I think that's a great story. Oh, man. So a lot of the information that I shared with you today, I did take that I found online from sources on Wikipedia. Again, I did not go real in depth. I just wanted to scratch the surface and give you guys a basic general historical overview of the Pennsylvania Dutch in Virginia. One area of particular interest there's Pennsylvania Dutch coming out. Sorry about that. For you would be in the town of Staunton, Virginia, which is in the Shenandoah Valley. Staunton has an open air museum, which is called the Cultural Frontier Museum, or I should have looked this up. But if you search Staunton, Virginia outdoor museum, that'll pop up. And what they have there is multiple. They've tried to show how each of these immigrant groups lived in early parts of the Shenandoah Valley. There's one set up for the Scotch-Irish, there's one set up for the English, and then there's one set up for the Pennsylvania Dutch portion. And what's really interesting is they have a house and a barn that were originally in the Palatinate region of Germany. They were torn down, sent here to America. This was around 1976, the late 70s, early 80s. And then here in Staunton, they rebuilt the house to look exactly like it did back in Germany. And this was to show as an homage to how the early Pennsylvania Dutch houses of the Shenandoah Valley looked. And they also have historical interpreters there working, showing how the Pennsylvania Dutch lived and farmed and survived in the Shenandoah Valley in the 1700s. It's a really great open-air museum. I highly recommend it. It's in Staunton, Virginia, again, down in there. And if you've never been to the Shenandoah Valley, I've been multiple times. It is beautiful. I do really appreciate the beauty and the culture of the Shenandoah Valley. Now I have a much greater appreciation knowing that there was this strong Pennsylvania Dutch influence into that part of the United States and into that part of our colonial history. All right. If you have an idea for a future video, please email me. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, well, what are you doing? You got to subscribe. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please just drop them in the comment sections down below. I'll put a link in the information session to that museum in Staunton. And if you're interested to learn more, get on the internet and see what else you can find out there about the Shenandoah Deutsch, the Shenandoah Valley Pennsylvania Dutch. All right, till next time, this is Doug. Have a great day. Practice your Pennsylvania Dutch, and Max gut.
Max gut.